Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, the trickle-down troika is back. The Liberal Party, Labor Party, big business, working together hand in glove to give big corporations more rights at the expense of everyday people. Now, I expect from this shambolic Liberal government nothing more than an attempt to give corporations more rights, to take away requirements to advertise locally first before you bring in someone from elsewhere for a job, to go and reward a government that is on the verge of backing out of international whaling agreements and starting again. I expect nothing less from the Liberal National Government. But what may come as a surprise to many people is that this blueprint to give corporations more rights over governments and people is now being cheered through and waved through by the Labor Party in this place, at a time when we've now got the opportunity to say we've got to go back and renegotiate some of the terrible provisions in this agreement, provisions that contravene the Labor Party's policy, and that even the Labor Party policy is here moving amendments to say we don't like the things that are in these agreements, at the very moment that we have the opportunity to say, well, we want better treatment. No. What is happening is that this bill is being brought on for debate and the Labor Party is cheering it through. Now, trade deals, it sounds innocuous. You're reaching an agreement with someone else to allow for greater trade. But what is not said in that is that these things aren't really trade deals. They're agreements about how corporations and governments are allowed to relate to each other. And they're agreements that say corporations in many instances, including multinational corporations, have more rights than the Australian government. Corporations will be able to tell the Australian government what to do if the Australian government ever tries to pass legislation for the benefit of its people. If the Australian government, under these deals, starts to pass legislation that might affect the profits of some of these corporations because we decide it might be in our interest to, for example, require the local advertising of jobs before allowing someone else to come in from overseas, or if we start passing laws to protect our environment, or start passing laws to protect public health because we think we want to look after the Australian people, corporations will be able to sue the Australian government in a secret panel where a few people get together, not a big court, a secret panel where a few people get together, and the decisions of that secret panel will be binding. And what that means is that this parliament loses its right to govern to protect the Australian people. Now, these clauses are so bad that they're off the table for the upcoming EU negotiations. The EU is not going to ask for these clauses to be in any agreement that might be signed with Australia. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand has had the good sense to negotiate side arrangements so that those clauses don't apply over there. The Labor Party has said at its conference these clauses are bad and we don't like them. But they're in this agreement that this bill is about to bring into effect. Now, these clauses have been used by corporations to sue governments because governments have tried to, for example, take steps to make drugs more affordable. Right? That's how these clauses get used. Or because governments have tried to do things to restrict corporations and the way their treatment of the environment. That's how these clauses have been used, and why, as I say, New Zealand has said we don't want a bar of them, and why they're not going to be in the EU agreements. So why on earth would we now sign up to them, knowing full well what it could mean for the Australian public? Not only that, but these agreements, like the agreements before them that Labor waved through as well, as part of the trickle-down troika, these agreements say that for certain countries, and in this case we're talking about Canada, Mexico, Chile, Japan, Malaysia and Vietnam, they get a free pass from the laws that exist in Australia that say you need to advertise locally first. They get a free pass, they get an exemption. And we are carving out now loopholes in our labour laws that are big enough to fly plane loads of exploited workers through. Right? Fly plane loads of exploited workers through. Because what we are seeing is that at the moment, under the agreements that we've got, these deals not only put downward pressure on wages for local workers, but they lead to exploitation of the overseas workers as well, because the overseas workers come in on visas, they get brought in with the promise of you'll earn more than in your home country, and who can fault people for sticking up their hand and saying, yep, I'll go and work somewhere and earn a bit more money. But they come here, and what happens when they come here is that the employers in many instances say, right, well, we've got you here. If you arc up, we'll withdraw your permission to be here and you'll be on the next plane back. So when you're here, you will accept whatever conditions that we require you, that we want to impose on you. And so as a result, we see in Hobart a couple of hundred people working, in some instances on public work projects, working at below legal wages and conditions. We've seen it in Victoria, we've seen it in Western Australia, we've seen it right around the country. And in Victoria, for example, working on the electricity networks, you would think if there's any thing called a project for the public good, it would be our electricity infrastructure. We've had people being brought in overseas to work on maintaining those networks in Victoria, getting paid below what others would get, what the going rate is, and being exploited. And it is all, in many instances, facilitated by these agreements, because now whatever requirements might be put in place in Australian labour law to restrict exploitation, these countries get a free pass. Australia will not be able to legislate to say, for example, we want to advertise locally first. And it is leading to exploitation right now. Exploitation of local workers, exploitation of these overseas workers. And it's why other countries say, well, we want the right to regulate that, and we're about to sign it away. And the Labor Party is about to sign it away. And we heard from the previous speaker that, oh, well, it's okay, put aside the advertising point. He said, oh, well, don't worry, at least everyone who comes in will be required to have the same level of skills. Well, that is just not right, because that is not how the skills testing system works in this country at the moment. In many instances, when people come in here, it's a paper-based assessment that's often tick and flick. There's not a systematic requirement to vet everyone who comes in to ensure that they're trained up to the same standard. It's you look at the paperwork and you take the word of the sponsor who's bringing them in. Now, that's not good enough either, and that's why in many instances what has been uncovered is people who we would say aren't trained to the same level locally. Now, we need a thorough overhaul of that. Now, what we're being told is it's okay, this new agreement won't change it. Well, that's not the point. The point is the system at the moment is thoroughly inadequate. People have been pointing to problems in it for a very long time. And what are we going to do? Well, we're now going to expand the number of people and the size of the loopholes through which people can pass. Now, when this TPP was negotiated, we were also told at the beginning that there was going to be 7 enforceable international environmental agreements as part of it. So, OK, it's all right. We'll still be able to protect the environment. Corporations won't have greater power over the environment. Well, when we saw the text of the agreement, it only mentioned 4, and it turns out that only one of them has got any enforceable commitments in it. And climate change isn't mentioned anywhere. There's no environmental benchmarks in these agreements. And what that means is that if in the future the Australian government, once we've turfed this rotten mob out and we potentially get a government that wants to act on climate change and protect the environment, when they legislate, they can't simply say, well, what would be for the good of the Australian people and what would be for the good of the planet. We now have to go off and check this blueprint for the corporate takeover of democracy. We have to go and check these agreements to see, oh, well, might we offend a corporation from another country, a multinational corporation, if we were to do something to cut our pollution or protect the environment? And if so, maybe we can't do it. Maybe we can't do it because we've signed up to a deal that allows a corporation and a secret panel of lawyers to veto what this parliament might want to do. And it's not just our future environmental laws, but even our future labour laws. Our future labour laws. There's lots of talk at the moment about how the system is broken and we need to change the rules. This might stop us changing the rules in the way that we need to, because we will have to make sure before we change those rules that it doesn't affect the profits of someone who might have a claim under one of these agreements. That is wrong. That is wrong. And it is why people are increasingly angry at governments, because they see governments signing away our rights to big corporations. And this is another example of it. And it's why the Greens have consistently opposed these kind of agreements that go beyond a simple agreement with another country to say let's trade more together, which in and of itself isn't objectionable, but they attach all these other things that restrict what governments can do. It's because of that that we have stood firm against them. And you've got the Greens saying this, you've got unions saying this, you've got civil society groups saying this, environment groups, NGOs all saying this. You've even got hardly well-known ideological allies of the Greens. You've got the Productivity Commission saying these agreements that we sign up to, actually, it's hard often to see what benefit they deliver to the Australian public. And what we need to do, at the very least, before we sign up to these things, is have an assessment of it so that we're not just being asked to take the claims of the Labor and Liberal parties on face value, but we actually see some evidence that it's not going to just help corporations, but it's going to help the Australian people. Well, that sounds like a pretty sensible idea, and I would have thought the government, if they thought this was such a cracker of an agreement, would come in here and say, well, look at the research, we've undertaken a big Productivity Commission analysis of it, look at the amazing benefits it's going to deliver. No, none of that, none of that. Just take it on our word that handing over your rights to big corporations is somehow going to be of benefit to you. And this all happens in the context, as I've said before, this all happens in the context of right now one of the parties to this agreement being in a position of wanting to restart whaling and pull out of, they've already pulled out International Court of Justice, but now to be able to say we want to go back to having full commercial whaling. Now, the Australian government should be holding them to account. And the Australian government should be saying, well, we've got some minimum standards, and if you want to do a deal with us that's about increasing economic activity, well, there's certain things that we want in return. There's certain minimum standards that we expect. As we've already heard, some of those things have been the subject of these negotiations, asking some other countries to perhaps try and at least say that they're going to lift their labour standards. Well, we've now got a great opportunity to say to Japan, if this agreement is so important to you, then it's repugnant to the Australian people that you restart whaling, and we can't, in good faith, sign up to an agreement that increases economic activity between our two countries if part of your definition of economic activity involves going and killing whales. But instead of standing up to them, we are rewarding them. This government is rewarding them and saying, it's all right, we're going to turn a blind eye to it. And just, we're quite happy to actually give you a pat on the back and reward you, hand you over a big fat reward. Now, that is reprehensible to many people, and there's absolutely no reason to rush ahead with this, especially in the context of so many people saying there are such big problems with it. We could say, park this until a better deal is negotiated. Park this until we get the kind of protections that Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, has negotiated for her people. Park this until labour rights are better. Park this until we remove the ability of governments to be sued by corporations just because they happen to stand up for their people. That's what the Greens will be pushing for. And today, you expect this from the Liberals, but the Labor Party stands condemned today because it's very crystal clear, doesn't matter what their policy is, they will vote for big business every time.